Hey everyone, it's Brett, and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Stack, where today I am sitting down with author Syed Masood for his new book, The Last Man in Paradise. I loved this book, and I know you guys are going to too. A little bit about Syed. He grew up in Karachi, Pakistan, a first generation immigrant twice over. He has been a citizen of three different countries and nine different cities. He is the author of The Bad Muslim Discount, a Book of the Month add-on pick, and an IndieBound bestseller, and two YA novels, More Than Just a Pretty Face and Sway With Me. So enjoy this episode of Behind the Stack. I'm really thrilled to have Syed Masood on the show today. First of all, I have to tell you that when I was late to the game, but I read Bad Muslim Discount last year, and I loved it so much. And I remember when I read it, I was like, I really want to talk to this guy. And so when I saw that you had a new book coming out, which is The Last Man in Paradise, I was so excited. And I actually just posted something on my Instagram page about this the other day when I had finished it. And I had so many people messaging me saying, "Oh, I didn't even know this is coming out yet. I'm so excited." So congratulations and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
By the way, when I was like doing a little, Googling on you, did you know the first thing that came up besides your picture is a character from the show EastEnders?
Yes, I've seen that.
Basically, he's a gay Muslim who starts sleeping. I went through the whole like storyline on Wikipedia. I was like, this is so fascinating. So, and then I was like, well, this is an interesting launch off of a book idea. So we were talking before we started about, your kind of nomadic existence, which you've always had that. Like you grew up moving around, correct?
Yeah, I mean, my dad came to the States for his MBA. We went to Texas, and then he decided to go back to Pakistan, and then he decided to move to Canada, and then back to the States. And then for the last few years, I've been traveling with my family. I've been dragging them around. So we've had some incredible experiences. We've gone to Athens, to Cairo, Kuala Lumpur, Indonesia. We've been there. We went to Pakistan for a while. That was probably a mistake. We traveled for 3 years. I take my wife to Pakistan, and she's like, "I think I want to go home." But yeah, so right now we're in Canada, which went to university here. I love this place. So I'm glad to be back for a while.
Yeah, I love Canada as well. And your kids are adaptable. They've done well.
Yes, they are getting to that stage where I'm starting to think we should probably, find some roots and have them have a routine and regular friends to go to school with. So
Yeah.
we're thinking about, finding a place long term. But yeah, they've had a blast, and they've gotten very used to travel. It's surprising how adaptable kids are, but I think they've gotten to the point where now we're talking about it, we're thinking about it.
They're adaptable until they're not. Now,
Right.
do you speak other languages?
Only Urdu because I grew up with it.
Okay.
And I can read Arabic, but I can't. Well, that's not true anymore. I used to be able to read Arabic, but I can't understand it because it taught me the phonics, so I could do the religious rituals and stuff, the prayers.
And how about your wife?
Same.
Cool. Did you meet at university?
No, it was an arranged marriage.
Wow.
Yeah,
And it
no,
worked out.
yeah, no, that was one of the big fears when you're growing up Pakistani and in a traditional Muslim household. You're gonna have an arranged marriage, and you kind of hope it works out. So thankfully it did. But yeah, she's actually her dad's from India. My family's from Pakistan, so my family had moved from India to Pakistan when the separation of the two countries happened. So
Yeah.
so we have a lot of cultural commonalities that way.
That's amazing. So I know you went to William and Mary School of Law. So, and you were at University of Toronto for English. What led you into writing, or what led you into one or the other? Was the idea like, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer to support my writing, or did you know you wanted to be a writer, or how did that kind of come about?
Oh, well, I mean, I've been writing stories since I was a kid, and I've always wanted to be a writer as far as back as I can remember, really. But
Apparently, some poetry too.
yeah, that was terrible. What the poetry? But yeah, I went to University of Toronto for. I actually originally got into the neuroscience program, which was not going to happen. But as with a lot of people from my background, I was being pushed into the sciences, and so going into English was a big change. But I loved it so much, I couldn't not do it. And then, the law, I sort of fell into it after basically 9/11. Things got so weird and strange. And then I sort of put a little bit of that into Bad Muslim, but it felt like the call of the times. And then after that, being a writer was a dream that I never thought would actually come true. And I was just writing for myself. And then one day I entered a contest and I ended up getting in, and it sort of took a life of its own from there. So,
Wow, that is so cool. And did you find, I had another writer on who was also a lawyer, or formerly a lawyer, because she stopped. But so I have to ask you that same question: did you find that your time as a lawyer had influence on your writing?
it changes the way you write a little bit. Actually, I think being a writer really hurts you as a law student. Because, you're taught to do certain things like not repeat words in a sentence or in a paragraph, and you're trying to be more artistic. And when you're doing legal writing, it's a very different exercise. So what I find is there's a lot more freedom in being a creative writer. A lot of fun to be doing constrained writing at one point in your day, and then later you can just sort of unleash and do what you want to do. So yeah, I don't think it influences it. I think it makes you, I suppose it does influence it. It makes you more cognizant of, are you getting to the point soon enough? Because just like the audience, the judges are going to sit around waiting for you to get to it, So
Yeah,
it's more aware of your tempo.
it's brevity.
Yes.
It's fascinating because it's almost like between the two, you're using two different parts of your brain.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to say brevity is not my strong suit. So it probably helped me a little bit to have to, conform to this different way of doing things.
God, I think I probably should have been a lawyer. I would have been helped as well. All right, so you have your two what we'll say adult novels, for lack of a better thing, and then you had two, which I didn't even know that you had these two works of young adult fiction. And I'd seen in a previous interview, and I loved, and I wanted, if you could just talk about this, do you explain how you term the two genres?
Yeah. No, I always say that, adult fiction is the fiction of sort of despair. Like, I've arrived at some point in my life and I don't like where I am. And how did I get here? And why did I get here? And how do I get out? If I can, And then young adult fiction is the fiction of hope. And it's becoming, of trying to do things for the first time. So they're very different genres. I love both. My young adult novels I had a lot of fun with. It's just a very different audience. You have to write differently for them. But there's pros and cons. I sort of go back and forth between the two genres. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about young adult fiction, and there's some great authors working in it right now. So
there's so many. I agree with you, and I think it's come so far. Like when I grew up, young adult fiction was the Hardy Boys.
The Hardy Boys. But there's so many of those. I read like 60 of those.
Yeah, remember that would be like the big Christmas gift. Is I'd get like 3 Hardy Boy books, that and possibly like a Choose Your Own Adventure and C.S. Lewis. That was it for my growing up. But now, I mean, the scope is so incredibly wide, and quite frankly, it's so sophisticated. Like the line is tenuous, I feel, between young adult and adult fiction. It's so narrow. So it's really cool. All right, so do you have an elevator pitch for Last Man in Paradise?
For The Last Man, it's basically a young man growing up in small town California who was born into a really religious family. His father's an imam, which is like a Muslim version of a priest. And they want him to be religious, or at least his father wants him to be religious. And he wants him to follow in his footsteps and become a preacher like he is. This young man is not at all religiously inclined, and understating it probably a little bit. He ends up very, very much pissing off his father, and essentially gets exiled to Egypt so he can go to school there at a very famous university, Al-Azhar, which is in Cairo. And he sort of escapes from Egypt, goes to England and becomes an actor. Doesn't tell his family though. His family thinks he's become this imam, whereas he's really an actor. And then there's going to be someone in the family, his grandfather, about to pass away. So he has to come back to Redding, California again for the first time in a decade or so. And he has to pretend to be an imam when he's not one. And that's where the hijinks ensue. So,
what was the genesis for this book for you? What was the idea that started it?
I'm going to get in trouble for answering this question. It's the kind of thing that gets me into trouble.
I can edit anything out.
No, it's fine. It's just, to be completely honest, it was listening to these. All religions are conservative, in my opinion.
Yes.
I mean, by their nature, they're conservative. And Islam is uniquely conservative because it uniquely says not only not only is this the word of God, but it's the last word of God, and it's never going to change, and it's for all time, and we have all the answers. And so that leads to some really interesting situations. So what inspired this was just listening to certain imams online on the internet who are very famous, just answer questions from people who have questions like, or situations like, is temporary marriage valid? Because you can't date people, but can you marry them for like a few weeks and then see if it works out? If not, can you get a divorce? And so there are these imams who have to deal with these questions online. And I remember watching a video where this one imam was complaining about this guy who would just go, to these poor countries and just marry women one after another, and just divorce them and get married again, because you can get married to 4 times, but that's not an upper limit. 4 is what you can have at one time. So wise as a man. So that's what I was like. Wow, there's a lot of potential for humor there, because there's so many, so many different ways people deal with these rules that they're born into, and don't want to leave necessarily, because, well, I mean, for one thing, and there are no Islamic states left anymore, but in an Islamic state, the penalty for apostasy is death. So that's a pretty big disincentive for leaving.
These are your options.
Or what happens more realistically is just being ostracized by the family. No one speaks to you. You lose a lot when you become an ex-Muslim. So a lot of people have to sort of find ways to navigate their lives, and so that, I know it sounds grim, but it also creates opportunities for comedy, and that's what I always look for. I look for things that are funny, but in a sad way. And so that's where a lot of my humor comes from. So Bad Muslims like that. This book is like that. And I thought, it would be cool to put some of these situations which Western readers don't always get to hear about in a novel, and sort of explore them.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I said, well, first of all, you completely, in what you said earlier in terms of the wives, you've completely described where you got the character of Tiger from, who is the uncle, who is one of my favorite characters, and he's so funny. But yeah, it's such an interesting thing because I said, you do a great job of showing that why religion can be pure, its followers might not necessarily be, and also the hypocrisy within it, and it's not even restricted to the Muslim community. I find it, I grew up in a very conservative WASP household. I went to church camp every year, but it was always such a strange thing for me because I always found the people who were the most kind of derelict were all under these trappings. And they were also the most judgmental of other people, which was always so fascinating as well. I was always like, wait, what? And it just kind of, I think there's a big difference between spirituality and religion are two very different things to me. And that's something too that comes up in this book, but also the idea that you present of like, what is a good person, what good deeds, and all of those things. And you paint things with a very gray stripe, should I say? But how do you, as someone who's Muslim, how do you rectify religious dogma with current life as it is?
Right, and that's the question of the book, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's I think everyone has to find their own answers to that. I don't know. I think this was actually covered in Bad Muslim, I think, but there's a line in Bad Muslim where they talk about uh, the two love interests are talking, and talk about how, when you come to the West, especially as a Muslim, you sort of put yourself together like a Frankenstein monster, and since you've put yourself together, there's no one quite like you, because you've taken some parts of this life and some parts of that life, a little bit West, a little bit Islam, or what have you. So, I think it's a question that is just not limited to Islam, though. I think it's every religious that, because for all their differences, religions are very much alike, in many ways. And so I'll often hear from people who are from different religious backgrounds who will say, yeah, I totally get this, The specific dogma will be different, but the issues are the same. So I think it's a very human experience of just trying to sort of reconcile your own conscience and your own worldview with the culture and the faith that you've inherited.
Yeah, you see I love this line in the book. I will say I marked you all up. Azan, the main character, is talking to his grandfather or his Baba. And he says, there's a difference between science and faith. And Baba says, no, there isn't. Baba countered, they're the same thing. Faith is magic before it is explained. And once it's explained, we call it science. And I love that so much though. But I agree with you. Like it was the whole thing with fundamentalism is fundamentalism. We're looking at it in the United States now, this Christian nationalism. It is the same thing. And there's also, there's a moment in the book that it's so shocking where his father whips him with a belt, and it's brutal. And it's so interesting because you do what you say, which is your books are so funny, and then you'll throw in this moment that's so real and so harsh that it's kind of like getting cold water thrown in your face. But at the same time, I feel like, and you could tell me, putting that in there was important to drive so much of both of this father-son relationship and all of it.
Right. I mean, there has to be real consequence. I mean, it's one thing to talk about the doctrine and it's not even Islam really. That's just cultural. And so, it's one thing to talk about it in the abstract. And then when something like that happens, it becomes real, right? And then the consequences are real. And so, one of the moments that surprised me in the book as I was writing it was, when Azan starts reflecting on what it means that his life as a Muslim Pakistani kid in America is so different from the girl that he's in love with, Jewish American. And they live like in the same neighborhood. They go to the same school, and this he's thinking this as he's raw from having been whipped. And well, actually, in that particular case, it is the religion because that's the punishment for drinking alcohol. But parents aren't supposed to carry that out. That's supposed to be the state. And like I said before, there are no Muslim states left. Anyway, at that moment, he thinks, but I've always been told this is good, right? I mean, this is the melting pot. This is multiculturalism, isn't it? But why do I hate it now? And so this is one of those books and one of those moments that surprised me as to make an admission that's unsurprising to anyone. Is you believe in these things, and sometimes these moments in fiction or in real life happen, and you're like, well, but that's not good, even though it sort of matches my philosophy. Like I'm for multiculturalism, but what do I say about this?
Yeah.
Causes harm. What do I do? So that was a real moment for me as a writer.
It reminds me of the question that people of faith have all the time in terms of like, why do bad things happen to good people? Or people praying to say like, why did my children develop cancer and die, and what's God's will? And there's just a tremendous amount of, again, it goes back to a faith, I guess, of I'm going to accept that, versus the other argument of I have a hard time accepting that a benevolent God would do something like this if he's really, I don't know. So it's that weird thing. I also think it's a strange thing now in terms of all with religion, with anything, because internet and these mini computers that we walk around with our hands every day have opened up a world to us that formerly was never available. So there is so much more information that's being disseminated and things that people are receiving that they never would have received before, that's opening up the world to all of us in terms of religion, in terms of everything, and in terms of forming questions that previously might not have been asked. So I have to ask, I know that we talked about, I know that you're really into sitcoms. And so I'm just curious because obviously that's what I work on, but what do you watch? And this is a larger conversation, but I just am curious, what do you love sitcom wise?
Oh, I mean, we talk about Scrubs because you worked on it, and it's one of my all-time favorites. I love Everybody Loves Raymond. I thought that was fantastic. I love Ray Romano as a writer because some of the best writing advice I ever got was through him, and I've talked about this before. But essentially, one of his cast members was talking about how great it was that they were able to make this social point that they wanted to make, and Ray said, but you have to earn it with the comedy. And that's the thing. You have to earn and that I find is there's a big conversation in our culture right now about woke entertainment, and what it means to be woke. And what I think if people would just follow Ray's advice, you'd be fine. Because if you earn it, if you earn the right to say what you want to say, it won't come across as preachy. I mean, Star Trek was being woke, like, no one called it that because they earned it with the suspense and the atmosphere and all that. So I think it's just a matter of earning it. And it's when a writer wants to say something that doesn't necessarily flow from the narrative and it doesn't feel earned, that we get into trouble. And that's sort of covered in this book a little bit because I poke fun at myself for the bad Muslim, where, at the end of Bad Muslim, I wanted to say something and I sort of had to push it out there. And then later I was like, I'm not sure if I earned that. I'm not sure if I earned that particular scene, And so one of the characters in this book calls out, she's a reviewer for fiction, and she's like, "Oh, that was bad." Oh, that was bad writing. So I think it's just, yeah, I think as long as we earn our stripes like Ray Romano does, we're okay. Aside from that, obviously the classics, Seinfeld. I'm trying to think of others that are less, big name. Arrested Development also,
Oh, so good.
it's a big name, but God, I love that show.
Oh my God. And you know what? It's so funny because I just went back and I started watching some of it again, and it completely holds up. I mean, it's so good. Like all of that cast was so incredible. But I asked all this about the sitcoms, and it makes total sense to me because when I'm looking at the construction of your book, it sometimes feels like a really smart single camera comedy to me. Even the way I kept thinking, you could literally be in a writer's room for a comedy because of two reasons. The book is almost structured into mini vignettes that have an A, B, and C storyline. You have a great love interest that's going on, this relationship that he's going home back to his family. He's left this girl behind. Will this thing get rekindled? It's so fantastic. You also, and you did this in Muslim too, you create such likable characters. I mean, incredibly likable that even when they're doing something that's despicable, you still are with them. And that's a real testament to your writing. But I kept thinking, like, God, you straddle the dramatic and the comedic so well. Is there a particular character in this one that you loved writing so much that you couldn't wait to get back to?
Oh yeah, I mean the grandfather, the Baba
Oh,
character was hilarious. I mean, and I get, this is the kind of stuff like I get a lot of positive feedback, and then I get some people who get very upset with me because religious people not always known for their sense of humor. And so they don't always like what the way I do things. But Baba the character is so outrageous, but so flawed and human at the same time.
mhm.
I had so much fun with him, and it was really sad because he wasn't in it. Like there were only a few scenes with him in it, but he is in some ways the catalyst for the story to happen. And he sort of orchestrates this, and it obviously goes completely sideways on him. But yeah, the scene with him, with Madison and Azan in the hospital, where he wants to freeze his brain because he's just realized I don't want to die. Turns out.
And for our listeners or viewers, Madison is the previous girlfriend to Hassan. So when you started to put this together and you talked about the inspiration for it, did you do it with this? Did you do it with the idea of like, okay, I'm going to take this kid or this young man and do this, or did you start with somebody different and then start to form around this idea, or how did it come together for you?
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, it starts with Stephen King's book on writing is really helpful for me. So essentially, he says, think of a scenario and sort of let your characters in the story sort of gather around this one scenario or scene. And the scene that came to my head for some reason was a young man like putting on a fake beard, like
Yeah.
to become the imam. And so then that's like I came up with the idea of the fake imam, and I was like, oh, this could really be something. And then there was a bunch of research because I wanted all the religious stuff in the book to be accurate, and even though I have grown up with the religion, what I was taught is not always accurate. So I have to make sure that's accurate.
Was it around a specific character and then it
Yeah, it
expanded?
was around Azan for sure. It was around the idea of, someone acting, someone putting on a show to become this fake imam. And that sort of morphed into him being an actor, which was not the original idea, but it seemed to fit really well. It also gave me an excuse to use Shakespeare and Chekhov and stuff. And so, that's always fun when you can do that. And so, yeah, that sort of, it started around Azan though, because it was such a compelling image, because it's literally putting on, we all sort of do this to a certain extent, right? We all put on masks when we go out into public and we deal with different types of people, different crowds of people. With our family, we are one way. With our partners, we are one way. And it's not even being you being dishonest. It's really just, that's what people need from you sometimes. Different people need you to be different things. And this
It's a
is
form of code switching.
right, exactly. And this is just taking that to like the nth level, where that's what the absurdity and the comedy comes in.
Yeah, no, and it's so incredibly well done. And then you also managed to like, and again, I haven't read your young adult books, but I'm assuming that they do high romance because many of them do. But your whole romantic side of this is so good. And another thing that you are such an incredible writer of, and this is again goes back to like the idea of sitcoms, is your dialogue. It is crackling. It is so funny. It is razor sharp. It is back and forth. I mean, I found myself laughing out loud, which only makes them between the two of them so much more charming. And you're like, my God, I feel like I'm in one of those, working title films from like the 90s, like the, Four Weddings and a Funeral and Bridget Jones' Diary. It's so fantastic. Was your family very conservative?
No, they became conservative. So there's this phenomenon that happens, this closing of the ranks when people move from Muslim countries, especially to the West, because all of a sudden you've never been a minority and you're in a minority now,
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of I don't want to use this phrase, but I will because I can't think of anything better. There's sort of this like self-herding into like little pens, and so we're like closing ranks, like we're like together for like we're like sheep huddled together for warmth or something. I don't even know to do that, but I'm assuming to do. So my kids are watching a documentary. I forget what the animal was. Maybe it was penguins. That makes more sense. Anyway, so my point is that we close ranks, we become more conservative, and I also feel like we get trapped in time. Because we sort of assume that the world we left behind is always going to be that way. And it's really shocking when we go back and it's like, oh, the world has moved on and things have changed. Pakistan now is not Pakistan 20 years ago. Obviously, why would it be? But, when you leave a place, that's the frozen fragment you carry with you. And so they bring that here and then they become more religious. Their friends are all in the same community because they speak the same language, and it sort of spirals. And so my family became more conservative over time. They were much more liberal in Pakistan, ironically enough. So, yeah.
Interesting. And it's funny because I was thinking you address this passage in the book about that a little bit in the book in terms of and the tenuous relationship between conservatives and liberals and also being Pakistani or Muslim in this community. But it's also, I sometimes feel like it's just what happens as people get older. Sometimes they just tend to become more conservative. But it's also, we're watching it happen on a grand scale right now in the US in this kind of insane way, this, harkening back to 1950s where, women stayed at home and made babies and there was a white picket fence and everyone knew their place and everyone,
Yeah, it reminds me of that another great sitcom. Now, this is an all-time classic, but what show was Archie Bunker on?
all family.
All in the Family. God, I keep thinking of the title song. We all knew
Yes.
who again.
Yeah.
It's just
And All in the Family would never get greenlit now. Like you could never get that on the air. Like everything that happened, and then the Jeffersons, the spinoff, all of these things that Norman Lear was doing at the time, any of those shows never would have gotten past development.
No, that's true. And Orient Publishing got published, but I'm just thinking about the fact that even back then there was just some nostalgia of like, let's go back to a better time. And I think that's rational. But for us, it's like global and politicized. So it's very different. But even back then, that title song is like you could modernize the lyrics and play it now, and people will be like, "Oh yeah, this is what's happening right now."
Yeah, no, 100%. That's 100% where we are. It's completely bizarre, but it kind of rounds out our conversation in that there is a universality that is happening with this book, and that it doesn't matter in terms of religion, which is such a major theme of this book, because I think people of all religions recognize not only these people, but what the arguments, discussions are, and that's what makes it, I think, so fantastic. Is you sit there and say, okay, it's the same. It's all really the same, and I think that's a testament to you and your writing, which is, I think, just it's so fantastic.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, one of the things of all my books, like aside from this one, but all of them, including Last Man, is just having been everywhere, like not everywhere, but having been a lot of places in the world, you sort of realize people are basically the same everywhere. They have the same needs and desires, and they've developed differently, and they have different cultures and stuff. But the fundamental humanity is the same. And so I try and capture that, and it's always gratifying to hear that I did that. So
no, you did it 100%. Look, I'm so excited for you, for our listeners and viewers. Go get it. Buy independent if you can, but it's really fantastic. And if you've not read The Bad Muslim Discount, absolutely get that, because it is also just equally as good as this. They're so great. I want to thank you so much for being here today. You're as funny as you are in person as you are in your writing. So it's incredibly gratifying. And I'm so excited to see what happens with this book. So congrats.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It was great talking to you. I appreciate it.